Good morning, everyone. Welcome to the Wilson Center. My name is Marissa Khurma, and I'm leading the Middle East Special Initiatives here at Wilson. We're truly honored to have a panel of experts today to discuss the Syrian refugee crisis. The global impact on refugees notes that millions of refugees live in protracted situations and often in low and middle income countries. And those countries, in most cases, face their own economic and political pressures. According to UNHCR, almost 12.2 million Syrians in the Middle East are either refugees in neighboring countries, Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, or internally displaced. And 8 years into the Syrian conflict, the refugee crisis continues to put economic and political pressures on host communities, as well as challenges on international actors. So our distinguished panelists today will highlight the current reality in the Middle East with regards to the Syrian refugee crisis, with a focus on long-term sustainable solutions, particularly in education, in the workforce, so economic inclusion, but also social inclusion. I'd like to welcome the panelists and introduce them. So, Mr. Richard Albright is Deputy Assistant Secretary at the Bureau of Population, Refugees, and Migration at the State Department. Sahar Aziz, Professor of Law and Chancellor Social Justice Scholar, as well as Director of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights at Rutgers University Law School. Jana Mason, Senior Advisor for External Affairs and Government Affairs at the UNHCR, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, and our Wilson Center Scholar and American University of Cairo Professor, Amy Austin Holmes. So welcome to all of you, and thank you so much for participating with us today. Richard, I'd like to invite you to give the opening remarks and outline the current U.S. strategy when it comes to the Syrian refugee crisis.
Great. Marissa, thank you very much for hosting us, for the opportunity to address an issue that's extremely important to us and everybody here in the room and with us, that of over 12 million displaced Syrians in the region. I would just say that, around the world, generally, the United States aims to protect refugees and internally displaced persons, alleviate their suffering, and find durable solutions for them in collaboration with the international community. And that includes advocating for resolutions to the conditions that produced the displacement in the first place. For the Syria response, the United States is the single largest country donor, providing more than $9.5 billion in humanitarian assistance since the start of this crisis for those affected by the conflict inside Syria and throughout the region. And we remain fully committed to providing life-saving support to Syrians impacted by conflict, most recently through our announcement at the Brussels III conference in March of more than $397 million in new humanitarian funding for the response in 2019. And we applaud those refugee hosting countries in the region, Turkey, Jordan, Lebanon, Egypt, and Iraq, that are making generous and critical contributions to support Syrian refugees. One way that the U.S. assists refugees and their hosts is to focus on supporting self-reliance. And by doing so, we can simultaneously reduce long-term dependence on humanitarian assistance, improve the quality of life of the most vulnerable refugees, and support local communities and economies. Professor Aziz highlights the importance of this in her recent report at Rutgers by recommending refugee incorporation into the national economy as a form of social cohesion and economic stimulation for all residents of the host country. And I would just say that no refugee arrives in his or her host community wishing to be a burden. Refugees I've talked to speak about their desire to send their children to school so that they and their children can be productive contributors to their communities. And refugees with access to education and the legal right to work are better positioned to contribute to their local economies, whether they integrate locally or eventually return voluntarily to Syria. An example of how this can work successfully comes from Turkey, where one of our programs supports refugees with medical experience to recertify their accreditations in Turkey. And that program has permitted hundreds of Syrian refugee doctors, midwives, and nurses to provide health care for other refugees in Turkey's migrant health centers. And serving refugees at these centers with refugee staff reduces the number of patients and wait times at local public hospitals and emergency rooms, and it also helps those Syrian refugee patients overcome language and cultural barriers when accessing health care. A growing body of evidence is showing that focusing on self-reliance of refugees and host communities can contribute positively to long-term solutions. In the World Bank's report called Forcibly Displaced, the bank found that refugees who have portable assets, mainly capital and marketable skills, are more likely to repatriate successfully, and that socioeconomic reintegration can be far easier for those who return with skills, education, and a financial buffer. And as the vast majority of Syrian refugees live outside of traditional camps, they've become important customers for local goods and services paid for with savings, labor income, remittances, and humanitarian assistance. In fact, a growing body of research demonstrates that humanitarian assistance produces a multiplier effect on economies. And in Lebanon, for example, each dollar spent on the refugee response generates an additional $0.6 in revenue, thus benefiting not just refugees, but also host communities and businesses. However, the converse is also true. A large influx of refugees can strain the ability of public services and host communities to provide water, electricity, and other basic services. And this is why U.S. development assistance focuses on strengthening service provision in refugee hosting communities. In Lebanon, USAID works at the local level, including with regional water authorities, for instance, to improve the availability and quality of water-related public services. So that helps the host communities, builds resilience, and it also addresses the additional needs that refugees create. So we talked about, I mentioned economic stimulus and economic burdens. So the stimulus that comes with a refugee influx, or any population growth for that matter, is very diffused, while the economic burdens are concentrated in public sector services. And this creates challenges in our dialogue with host governments who carefully calculate and articulate the added costs they bear, while often lacking good data and remaining silent on the positive impacts of refugee spending power on local economies. And this is a topic I think that merits further research and analysis. The World Bank also found in its studies that education is key to preventing future intergenerational poverty for Syrian refugees. And it should be of deep concern to all of us that nearly 40% of Syrian refugee children in the Middle East are not enrolled in formal or informal education. And this is a problem we're taking steps to address in partnership with host countries. An example of this education support comes from Lebanon, where the Ministry of Education and Higher Education made the decision to establish second shifts in schools while simultaneously expanding support for Lebanese children attending the first shift. And with funding from the United States and other donor governments, Lebanon has been able to enroll 220,000 Syrian refugee students in Lebanese schools. However, I would say that low retention rates for older children in the school highlight the need to focus intensively on alleviating the barriers families face in education. So I think we've made some significant progress, but there's much more work to be done. And this gets just really to, I think, what is a point that as we face protracted refugee situations, and I think UNHCR's data shows that the average length of displacement is now about 10 years for refugees, just kind of globally. The humanitarian community alone just simply cannot or should not address all of these needs. And as the Syria crisis becomes protracted, refugees often face more of a development than a humanitarian challenge. And refugee hosting countries are under tremendous economic pressure, and we must consider the needs of host communities. And we need to change the way in which we respond by integrating development interventions with humanitarian assistance and ensuring that there is strong collaboration and synergy with development actors from the very beginning of a refugee crisis. The U.S. government has supported Jordan as a refugee host through bilateral development assistance, and USAID and other donors have supported Syrian refugee access to public education through a multi-donor account that pays the costs of public education for Syrian refugee children. And these efforts are in addition to traditional development educational activities such as building new schools and supporting additional teacher training. A second multi-donor account started in 2018 will help the Jordanian Ministry of Health provide primary health care services to Syrian refugees at subsidized rates that they can afford. And in all of these efforts, the United States has been working with the World Bank, the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, the International Committee of the Red Cross, and other partners to better include refugees and conflict-affected populations in development programs. And with U.S. support, the World Bank in recent years created 2 new financing mechanisms to support refugee hosting countries: the Global Concessional Financing Facility, the GCFF, for middle-income countries, and the IDA-18 regional sub-window for refugees and host communities in low-income countries. And as of mid-2018, the concessional financing facility had dispersed $500 million in grants, which in turn have leveraged over $2.5 billion in concessional financing to support refugees and their host communities in Jordan and Lebanon. And the U.S. contributed $35 million of that to the GCFF projects in Jordan. And they've supported enhanced economic opportunities, energy and water infrastructure improvements, education support, and health provision. In Lebanon, the World Bank is mobilizing concessional financing through the GCFF to pioneer an integrated approach to private sector job creation. The response model in Jordan and Lebanon is similar to the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, the CRRF, to give you another acronym. We support UNHCR's implementation of the CRRF globally, and it seeks to bring concrete action to support host communities, enhance refugee self-reliance, promote third country solutions, and improve conditions in countries of origin to enable safe and voluntary repatriation. The Jordan Compact from 2016, which was linked to substantial donor support to Jordan, offered an extraordinary opportunity to bring refugees into the formal workforce and allowed humanitarian and development actors to collaborate on expanding livelihood opportunities for Jordanians and Syrian refugees. However, current limitations on the sectors where refugees are able to work may limit Jordan's ability to benefit from a broader range of refugee skills and abilities. And let me just touch on the issue of Syrian refugee returns. The United States is steadfast in prioritizing a course of action that enables the safe, voluntary, dignified return of refugees to their home countries if and when conditions permit. And that's the solution that most refugees themselves prefer. But we must ensure that refugee returns to Syria meet these criteria and that refugees choose where they want to return in Syria. And current conditions are simply not ripe for large-scale returns. And if refugees do return prematurely because they're pressured to do so or because they lack protection elsewhere, these returns will not be sustainable and will likely lead to a revolving door of new displacement. And first and foremost, it is incumbent upon the Syrian government to create the political, economic, and social conditions that will create space for displaced Syrians to return. But given the reality that most Syrians are likely to remain in neighboring host countries, we have to be prepared to assist these countries in accommodating large populations of Syrians for the medium to long term. And this underscores the need for complementary development approaches. In conclusion, the United States remains committed to providing protection and life-saving assistance to the most vulnerable displaced Syrians affected by the conflict. We will continue to work to advance interim and durable solutions for promoting self-reliance and resilience for refugees, including through support for host communities and local institutions and collaborating with our development partners. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Richard. Jenna, I'm going to turn to you after having heard Richard talk about the importance of integrating economic development solutions and maybe getting that conversation starting much earlier than sort of after the emergency response has began. To just outline UNHCR's approach and how this has changed over time given the protracted nature of the refugee crisis.
Great, thanks. Well, thank you, Marissa, and I want to thank Wilson Center for hosting this event on what we consider to be still the World Refugee Day period that we're in. Last Thursday, the 20th, was World Refugee Day. We acknowledge it, celebrate it. It doesn't seem to be something that you would celebrate, and clearly the conditions that create refugees aren't something we celebrate, but we use it as a time to acknowledge the dignity of refugees and the resilience of refugees around the world. And the Syria crisis, the Syria situation, is a case in point of refugee resilience. And in fact, it's that resilience and the issue of Syrians that really brought to the global stage this new approach that Richard really laid out and that we're here to talk about in terms of focusing on livelihoods, focusing on education, focusing on solutions in the interim. Last Thursday on World Refugee Day, we released new figures. So just to put Syria in context, the current global displacement level it's a little bit hard now. Can't round it to 70 million. It's closer to 71 million globally displaced. That breaks down to roughly 40 million internally displaced, people who have fled their homes for refugee-like reasons but haven't crossed a border, and roughly 25 million refugees who have crossed a border. Of the 25 million, you can break that down roughly into 21 million who are under my agency's mandate, UNHCR, and another 5.5 million who are Palestinians under the mandate of UNRWA. So there's a separate UN agency that addresses them. Syria, once again, leads all the statistics in terms of forced displacement. In terms of internally displaced, Syria is second only to Colombia. Syria has 6.2 million internally displaced. Colombia, I think, is still between 7 and 8 million. In terms of refugees, Syria remains the largest producer of refugees. Roughly 6.7 million, so roughly a quarter of the world's refugees come from Syria. So if you add the internally displaced and refugees together, you have about 13 million, which I believe is roughly half of the pre-war population that has been uprooted from their homes. So clearly, this situation, just on virtue of the numbers alone, has driven the international community to make some changes. Another two factors of the Syria crisis that Richard acknowledged, one of them being the protracted nature. We define protracted refugee situations as 5 years or more. In the Syria situation, now we're in the 9th year, and if you add refugees and IDPs together, many people globally are uprooted for close to 2 decades. Syria also brought to the fore another phenomenon of urban displacement. Around the world, camps are no longer the norm. People still talk about refugee camps, and the media likes to go there. It's a more compelling image. But globally, roughly 60 to 70% of refugees are not in camps anymore. In the Syria situation, it's even more striking. 93% is an urban population. Only 7% of the Syrians remain in camps. You know, when the crisis first broke, Turkey took the lead in establishing camps along the border. They tended to be quite good camps, as camps go. But over time, as the numbers increased, eventually people moved out of the camps. Turkey's moving to close the remaining camps, the centers as they're called, or temporary centers, and it's largely an urban population now. Jordan established a big camp, Zatri, and then another one, Azraq. A lot of people have visited, a lot of media. Every king, queen, celebrity has visited Zatri. It's an amazing image. but even Zatri isn't full to capacity anymore. Most of the refugees over time moved into urban areas. So very much a protracted situation and an urban situation. Now, what led us to adopt this new approach that Marissa's asking me to talk about, I've been working in the refugee field for many years, local resettlement, global issues, and for a long time it was kind of business as usual. I would say this started changing around 2015. In 2015, you saw the images of Syrians and other refugees, but largely Syrians, going across the Mediterranean to Europe. And all of a sudden, everybody woke up and said, we have a refugee crisis. The refugee crisis was not in Europe. It was in Syria and these other countries and neighboring countries. But all of a sudden, everybody woke up. So the media, and for understandable reasons, would often have us believe that most refugees are crossing oceans or border or deserts, as in the case of the Americas, to try to reach the Western world. The reality, as with Syrians, is that most refugees cross one border and stay there for years or decades. Of the 6.7 million Syrian refugees, over 5.7 million are in the neighboring host countries that we've mentioned. Yet, when the images of Syrians trying to get to Europe, because at that point it was 5 years, they were growing, there was a lot of discontent, they thought they would seek another solution. We call that secondary migration. The world started saying, maybe we need a new approach. It's something that my agency, the State Department, Humanitarian and Development Actors, had been talking about for many years. We used to refer to it as the relief to development nexus. But what developed after these conversations that grew very intense in 2015 and 2016 was really a new approach that Richard mentioned, the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, that is also part of something we call the Global Compact on Refugees. This was developed largely in late 2016, but even before then, earlier in 2016, there was a donor conference for the Syria situation in London where people really got serious about making some changes in the Syria context. And at this donor conference in London in, I think it was February 2016, the World Bank, other players, and host countries and donors came together to make some commitments to improve the lives of Syrian refugees. Specifically for Jordan, there was a compact, an agreement arranged whereby Jordan would agree to enhance livelihood opportunities for refugees. And in the case of Lebanon, they agreed to enhance education opportunities for refugees. And this basically was needed because what we consider to be the traditional solutions for refugees just haven't been working anymore. You know, the best solution, as Richard mentioned, is return home. But in recent years, we've had the lowest level of voluntary return since the mid-1980s. Even in the Syria situation, last year, we had about 56,000 Syrians who voluntarily returned home, and about 1.2 million Syrian internally displaced who returned to their home communities. This is good, but as Richard said, we're not supporting large-scale return yet because the conditions just aren't there. And this is true of conflicts globally. They go on and on and on. They don't get resolved. People don't return. The second solution, local integration, which means when a country gives refugees on their territory the rights or something close to the rights of their own nationals. That's wonderful when it happens. But as was mentioned, most refugees, 80 to 90% of refugees are in the developing world, countries that have their own economic and political challenges. So nationalizing a whole group of foreigners is usually not something they feel they can handle. And resettlement, third country resettlement, of which the U.S. traditionally has been the leader, globally, that's just not a viable solution. We used to say less than 1% of refugees get resettled. I did the math with last year's numbers, and if you actually look at the 90-some thousand refugees that got resettled globally out of 25 million, 0.6% of the world's refugees can get resettled in a third country. It's a vital solution, but it's very limited. So if refugees aren't going home, if local integration isn't happening and they can't get resettled, the reality is what Richard mentioned, just decades or more of waiting in limbo. So the new approach, which people had been talking about, really galvanized around 2015, 2016 because of the Syrians, a small number of them getting on boats and trying to get to Europe. And what resulted from it was something, again, called the CRRF, which is an approach that focuses on giving host communities more assistance so that they will keep their doors open to refugees. Richard talked about the World Bank, the concessional financing facility. This has made loans available to middle-income countries that normally wouldn't qualify, or some of the poorest countries that get IDA money that are hosting refugees. They can use this money in different ways, and more money is available. Most governments don't want to take a loan just for refugees, but if it's very low interest, long repayment, if part of it is a grant, they're interested in taking this money if they can use it for their host communities. That will help convince them to keep their doors open. So in the past few years, with the World Bank, new approaches, with other development actors, private sector, we've made some significant progress in education and livelihoods for refugees. Nowhere near the progress we would like, but some significant progress. On livelihoods, Jordan has made an average of about 50,000 work permits available per year for Syrian refugees. Turkey, in the same time, has made about 60,000 work permits available. They've also encouraged local business and more entrepreneurship. In some of the other countries, like the Kurdish region of Iraq and Egypt, it's still more the informal sector where refugees work, but they have reduced some of the barriers to employment and allowed refugee businesses and refugee workers to thrive a little bit. It's not a lot of work visas in the grand scheme of things, but it's definitely a start. What we're trying to do now is find ways to help refugees move up the ladder of jobs. Most of them are still working, I think as Richard mentioned, in the unskilled labor areas because these governments fear competition for higher skilled work, which means Syrians who were doctors, other medical professionals, engineers, can't easily find employment. But if through this new funding mechanism, Jordanian and Turkish and Lebanese trained doctors and engineers can find more work because we're improving the medical system or the educational system or the schools or the roads or the hospitals, that will open up space for Syrians to move into those jobs and then move up the ladder. We are finding a tremendous need for access to credit, microenterprise. So we're working with the private sector to invest more in these countries and provide more loans and access to capital and to credit so that refugees can become entrepreneurs. On education, we estimate that the school-age Syrian refugee population in the region is roughly 2 million. And as Richard said, at this point, only about 60% of them have access to either formal or non-formal education. This is better than it used to be. It's still not enough. It means about 40% have no access. Because of some of the commitments over the years in Lebanon and elsewhere, access to formal education has improved. Unfortunately, access to regulated, non-formal, catch-up classes has declined in recent years. So we're at about a level of 40% out of school. And this is only at the primary grades. At secondary level, it's more like only 25% or so that have access. I will say, though, one interesting statistic is that in terms of access to university, which these countries have tried to look at, roughly 5% of Syrian refugees in the 4 main host countries are enrolled in university. This compares with only about 1% of refugees globally, so it's good news, but it's nowhere near the global population that's enrolled in university, which is like 30-some%. So we have a lot of work to do there. And one other final interesting statistic in terms of education is that girls' enrollment, if you're a Syrian refugee girl in the region, you're about 5% more likely to be in school than boys, which is contrary to what we normally hear, that girls are kept out of school, boys are favored. In many refugee situations, that's the case. But this statistic leads to another tragic reality, which is the reality of child labor. The number one impediment to children's access to school is the fact that most Syrian refugees are still in very difficult economic situations. About 70% are living in poverty. They keep a lot of their kids, particularly boys, particularly teenage boys, home from school so that they can go out and work and supplement the family income. And this shows the serious connection between work visas and employment. If the adults in the family can work legally and make sufficient money, they're more likely to send their kids to school. Unfortunately, there are other reasons kids are out of school. Sometimes it's violence, exploitation, bullying, abuse. Domestic violence at home is a reality. Some refugee children experience violence in schools, in communities. So we're working with the governments in the region to really establish more safe spaces for kids to learn, whether it's informal or informal. I was asked to say a quick word about social protection, which is basically a term that we use for any assistance that we give to try to address vulnerability, so it's sort of like resilience, to try to help refugees and host communities absorb the shocks and be more resilient and thrive and be less likely to fall into desperation or vulnerability. So this runs the gamut from education and health assistance, supplements for housing and shelter, health insurance in some countries where refugees don't have access, as well as a lot of community engagement to try to increase the bonds between refugees and their host communities. So this is just to say a lot has been done, but we're nowhere near where we want to be in terms of jobs and education for kids. But lest we get lost in the details and the statistics that we've thrown out, the key message, as Richard made clear, is still that 9 years, in the 9th year of this conflict, it's not the time to retreat. There's so much pressure on refugees to return and pressure on UNHCR to facilitate that return, which we're not doing yet. And as Richard said, premature return, we've learned throughout many examples in the rest of the world, if return happens too quickly and is not sustainable, it will result in another outflow. And this time, refugees will have learned from their experience and they won't be quick to return again. So this is not the time to turn away. The host communities, even though we can look at them and criticize why aren't there more work visas, why aren't more kids in education, the reality is they are shouldering the vast majority of this responsibility. Turkey is the world's largest refugee hosting country. Lebanon is the world's largest per capita refugee hosting country. I live in Maryland. Lebanon is a third the size of Maryland, and it's hosting 1 million refugees. As efficient as the Maryland government may be, I don't know if it would absorb this the way that Lebanon has. So these governments have to be recognized as creating a global good, as we call it, and contributing to regional stability. They need to continue to be supported. But ultimately, since the traditional solutions aren't working, what we need is not only more creative finance and more investment, we need more solutions, more legal pathways for refugees, and ultimately we need to start putting in place the conditions for return, because that's the long-term solution.
Thank you. Thank you, Jenna. I'm going to turn to you, Sahad, because you recently published a report that Richard mentioned titled Towards Sustainability and Empowerment, Reforming America's Syrian Refugee Policy. So I reckon that many of the points mentioned, particularly with regards to the workforce and education, is at the heart of your findings. So if you can kindly share some of these findings and the recommendations that you've outlined to U.S. policymakers.
Well, first, thank you so much for inviting me. It's a pleasure to be here at the Wilson Center, and credit goes to you, Marissa, and your team for hosting this event, because unfortunately we seem to have forgotten about these 12 million people. And simply because it's not in the news doesn't mean that it is no longer a serious problem. And I was heartened to hear some of the numbers that Mr. Albright mentioned in terms of the United States financial commitments, although I do have some critiques of the U.S. government policy, which I'll list in a minute. The first thing I just want to highlight, because I look out at the audience today, I see a lot of young faces, and so I'm very heartened to see that this generation, I'm going to stereotype you as millennials. I think there are a lot in the room, and many of us who have aged out of being the generation, of the day, we depend on you to defend human rights. We are having a human rights crisis in this country. I think that we are unfortunately starting to turn our backs on human rights as a country, at least some of the rhetoric that's coming out of our government. So we are depending on you. I'm glad you're here. And as someone who fought for human rights when I was your age, it's a lifetime fight. right? It's an intergenerational fight. So please do not give up, and regardless of the depressing numbers, you do make a difference in believing in human rights in general, including refugee rights. So the first thing I wanted to highlight, much of what I wanted to say, or much of what's in this report, which I recommend you read, it's on the website of the Center for Security, Race, and Rights, which is csrr.rutgers.edu. And for the Twitter generation, its tag is @RUCSRR. So I will focus primarily on the major key points. Our 4 recommendations are fund programs empowering refugees to be economically independent. That would be these are recommendations for the U.S. government. Increase U.S. aid to Jordan and other neighboring countries to strengthen state institutions to provide basic services like healthcare, like education, and the private sectors of these neighboring countries. The third is support humanitarian projects that assist both Syrian and non-Syrian refugees, and I'll talk a little bit about the non-Syrian and Syrian issue, and then admit more Syrian refugees into the United States.
Excuse me, can I go ahead and see if I can switch you back to that other mic, because that's
Sorry.
causing problems with our auto gating. Can you talk on that and see if it's working?
Is it working? No.
No.
We've got it in the other room, so let me just do this. We'll switch just to one mic, because
Okay.
it's actually causing a problem.
No problem. Thank you.
Thank you.
Okay, and then finally, to admit more Syrian refugees into the U.S., notwithstanding Jana's good point about the percentage. So first is, many of you know that the neighboring countries are already suffering from economic troubles and economic hardship. And that's something that we have to take into account as a country that has a remarkable amount of wealth, right? Even though our wealth may not be equally distributed among our population, we do have a lot of wealth and a lot of resources within this country. And so we have to understand that in these countries, these are the types of things that they're dealing with. They have unemployment rates that are, for example, in Jordan, 15%, 11% before the crisis, 15% after the crisis. Those are low numbers. Those are the official numbers, at about 5 to 10% more. 29% of Jordan's youth were unemployed before the crisis. In Lebanon, 21% of Lebanon's youth were unemployed before the crisis, so that it goes up. And so what you're dealing with is countries that already have high unemployment, and they have stagnant economies. In Jordan, their economic growth rate is only 2%, and most of that is from foreign aid. They're 95% in debt, so their debt is 95% of their GDP. And they import 96% of their energy, and they're the second most water poor country in the world. So we just need to be thinking about the realities that they're dealing with. And in many ways, when we went to Jordan, this report is based on me and a group of students going to primarily Amman to talk to Syrian refugees, to talk to the NGOs, to talk to the people on the ground and ask them, well, what do you think? And compare the research in which my colleagues here have cited to see, does it mesh up? What are your experiences as a Syrian refugee? And what we heard was in many ways expected, but there were a few unexpected things. So the first, with regard to the work permit program, many of the Syrian refugees and the NGOs working with them find it to be an abysmal failure. Not for lack of good intentions, but one, the overall number is not enough. So the Jordan Compact includes 200,000 work permits. I believe that's the total, if I'm not mistaken. I don't think that's annual. So remember the numbers that we're talking about. Jordan has about 1 million, between 700,000 to 1.2 million is the estimate. 200,000 total work permits is just not enough. Of those, what we found, at least based on our research, is only about 104,000 have actually been issued. So not only is the low number not being issued, but or is the number low, but they're not all being issued. And then to complicate it, they're limited to only sectors in which foreign migrant workers work in. So agriculture, construction, manufacturing. And there is a major skills mismatch. So Syrian refugees, because you're talking about such a large number of people, come from every level of socioeconomic class. You have people who are very highly educated, doctors and engineers and entrepreneurs. Some of them are quite wealthy, and those are the ones that have been able to withstand the crisis better, but most of their savings has now been depleted. Then you have just your average middle-class person who has a bachelor's or a master's in something, and they come, and now suddenly they're unemployed and they're living below poverty. In Jordan, 80% of Syrian refugees live below poverty, 64% in Turkey, 76%. And again, these are not people who necessarily lived in poverty in their home country, so it's kind of a double whammy, so to speak. And many of them came to us and said, I'm an engineer. I want to work. I'm ready to work. I will work, but they won't give me a work permit. They won't let me work, assuming that there's even a job available, which is a separate issue. With regard to teachers, so we spoke to some of the Syrian refugees, the mothers in particular, who were very upset that their children, not all of them could get into school. Now, to the credit of the Jordanian government, they did something similar to the Lebanese government, which they did these double shifts. And they have the Syrian children going in the afternoon. Now that, there's a whole separate but equal problem, which, as a U.S. lawyer, there's red flags that go off. But in light of that, those circumstances, it's certainly better than nothing, and the Jordanian government should get credit. However, even that wasn't enough because they didn't have enough schools. There just wasn't enough infrastructure for this huge influx of students. So there was a significant number of students who there just wasn't space for them, and so they didn't get to go to school. Or they had the space, but they didn't have the teachers. They just didn't have enough Jordanian teachers. However, we heard from Syrian refugees, and a lot of this is anecdotal, is that we have teachers. We have Syrian teachers who have years of experience as teachers in Syria, and they want to work. And they want to work in the public school system, and they'll teach the Syrian children. But again, because of the work permit issues, they were not allowed to do that. So you have a large number of people. I mean, we're not talking about tens or 20s, hundreds of thousands, or at least tens of thousands who are skilled, who have a formal education, who have experience, and who need to work. And then you have people who are in need, the refugees who need doctors, who need nurses, who need teachers, et cetera. So there is that mismatch that I think ultimately we need to address from an international perspective. Now, with regard to work, there were a couple of initiatives that some of it was based on our research, some of it in desk research, some of it was based on speaking with people. So the young professionals and the young Syrian refugees working with young Jordanians and young Iraqi refugees and Sudanese refugees, because there are a lot of different refugee communities in the Middle East. And that was a lesson that we learned, that even the Syrian refugees said, we don't want all the resources to come to us because we don't want to neglect. We have empathy for other refugee communities. So a holistic approach is really important, and I know that that is something that at least the policymakers are thinking about. Implementation can be a challenge, but when we're funding or when we're strategizing, you don't want to favor one over the other because that also creates tensions, social tensions, which causes many state governments to not want refugees, because most governments, they're already dealing with economic troubles. Some of them are dealing with security issues that are part of conflicts that arose out of the U.S. occupation in Iraq, and and now who knows what's going to happen with Iran. Being an academic, I can speak a little bit more freely, so I appreciate that. But we'll go back to the context of the economy. So some of the youth would put together nonprofits, and they would try to work on resilience projects where they would put fairs on for the children, and they would come up with really creative ideas, such as they would raise money among some wealthier donors across the Middle East, or maybe Syrians that are in other countries, even in the diaspora in the United States, for example, and they would pay the daily wages of the young boys to the families and say, if we pay you how much you would make for your son, will you put him in school? And many of them said, yes, we want to put him in school. We just can't afford not to, because what I'll call the dependency aid is shrinking. I mean, first, as a matter of philosophy or of strategy, dependency aid is not sustainable, which is where you just give people money to buy food and that's it, and they can't become economically independent. It's necessary in the beginning, but that's not what the Syrian refugees want. They don't want just checks every week. They want to work, right? They want to be economically independent. So those are some of the creative ways that some of the youth and the young professionals, so I would also recommend that whatever money we put into these host countries, that we integrate the young professionals, we integrate the host youth into coming up with some very creative ideas that isn't simply coming from these very large NGOs, but also people straight that are on the ground. Now, IKEA had an interesting model where this is, I believe, part of the Jordan Compact, if I'm not mistaken. It's one of the incentives for businesses from Europe to go, and if they have a branch there or a manufacturing company, that they would get some tariff-free incentives and maybe some loans, but different economic incentives for them to hire Syrian refugees. So IKEA hires 15% of its workers are Syrian refugees. It also hires local Jordanian citizens. It had 100 people in, I believe, 2017, and it's trying to get to 400 in 2020. These are small numbers, but they're better than nothing. And so these are the types of recommendations we've also made in our report, which is to have the United States. We are not, if I'm not mistaken, Mr. Albright, I don't think we are a member of the Jordan Compact. Is that correct? The United States? I think that's the EU.
It's the EU,
The
the World
EU.
Bank, Jordan.
Right. So I don't think the United States.
Yeah.
Right, but I don't think that
the World
the
Bank.
United States is, for example, our businesses are incentivized to do these types of projects and to try to increase that and bring our own businesses. They don't have to be big businesses, but how can we create jobs there that will help the refugee population and help, maybe we would import some of those goods tariff-free, et cetera. Again, the point is not simply to just give dependency aid, right? It's a way where we have to give the aid. I think we should give the aid as an international responsibility, but to do it in a way that empowers the refugees, which is what they want as well. Okay, so I will just end with a few other points. The first is based on what we saw from the Syrian refugees, we saw a desire to work, a desire to go to school, a desire to go home at some point. There was a poll that showed that 76% of, I think this was by the University of Jordan, 76% of refugees, Syrian refugees, they want to go home. It's just not safe yet. And that the poverty rates were very high. The second point I want to make is that there's a important need for monitoring and accountability. And this is, when you're at this high level at the Wilson Center talking at a macro level, it's very important that we're strategizing right now. We're thinking big picture. But as we all know, those of us who have worked on the ground, is the accountability and the monitoring is really important. Sometimes things just don't work out the way they're supposed to. Sometimes the money isn't effectively and efficiently spent. And you need to go talk to the people that are the beneficiaries and find out, are you actually really getting what we think you're getting? And if not, how can we fix and how can we incorporate that? And then finally, I do want to mention the resettlement issue in the United States. We intentionally and purposely decided to focus, when we did our research, on the region, because if you want to make the biggest impact, you need to go to where the largest number of refugees are. And right now, that's in the Middle East. That being said, we heard a lot of concerns by the refugees, by the international NGO community, by local NGOs, about the rhetoric that was coming out of the US government that was very anti-Syrian refugee. And the actual policy where we decreased our quota to 30,000. This administration now is at 30,000, and 9,000 of those 30,000 can come from the Near East, or essentially the Middle East and North Africa. And then, as we know, the actual numbers that are processed are even less than that. Now, the reason why that's important is not simply because we're going to, if we get 30,000 or 45,000, that's going to make a difference it'll make a difference in those people's lives, but it's 0.6% overall. It's the message, it's the signaling effect. It's the influence that we have. And it tells the governments there that we take this issue seriously. We're doing our share, we're bringing refugees in and taking care of them, and you need to too. But if we say, well, we don't want them, and we think they're terrorists, or our government is saying that, which is absolutely false, and there's no connections, even if you find one or two cases, but people have been looking, and Syrian refugees are not engaging in terrorism. The ones that are civilians out, that are not in the militias, but that are actually refugees. And you're sending a message to them that we don't care about them, we don't want them, they don't matter, they have no value. And therefore, the governments abroad will take the money from the US, but they won't take the issue seriously. They won't feel accountable, and they'll also feel exploited. As well, why aren't we're doing all this work and we're shouldering this burden, and what are you doing? Even if it's not as large of a number, but even just it's symbolic. So I say that because all of you, presumably, most of you can vote, and something that you have to know that's really important is you get to control what our government does. We may not be able to control what the Jordanian government or the Lebanese government or the Syrian government or the Turkish government, but we do get to control what the American government does. And so I'm glad you're here. Thank you for coming, and I do urge you to feel empowered in terms of shaping U.S. Syrian refugee policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Sahar. I want to turn to you, Amy. You were just in Syria, in the northeastern part in particular, and you got to witness the reality on the ground, particularly with regards to the IDPs, the internally displaced. And I think you also have a sense of, well, what is perpetuating this crisis? So I think you can give us more context and tell us a little bit more about some of the challenges facing the IDPs in Syria.
Great, thank you. All right, should I?
No, I think we can.
Okay, great. Yes, thank you everyone for being here, and thank you, Marissa, for organizing this. I just wanted to make one point that the Syria Study Group just came out with its interim assessment in May, and they too recommended that the United States admit 5,600 Syrian refugees. That would be 0.1% of all Syrian refugees worldwide, and roughly 1% of the Syrian refugees in Germany. So I too agree that, as an American citizen, we need to do more, and it's really our responsibility to admit more Syrian refugees, given that this is a crisis of, the largest refugee crisis that we are currently dealing with, I think, in our generation. I will, however, not speak about the refugees outside Syria, but about the situation on the ground in northeast Syria. I was there for about 5 weeks in February and March. It was my 5th trip to northeast Syria since 2015. I made my first trip in June 2015. That was soon after Kobani had been liberated, after the U.S. began cooperating with the Syrian Democratic Forces. At the time, it was still the YPG or YPJ, now the Syrian Democratic Forces. So I've included this map from the Institute for the Study of War. The purple in the northeast is the region that is now under the control of the Syrian Democratic Forces, the SDF, as well as the purple farther south of that is the Al-Tanf base, where there are also a small number of U.S. troops located. So I actually think if we compare the situation now, and it's important that we're doing this now because it is Refugee Awareness Month, but I actually also believe that compared to the situation, let's say 6 months ago, or back in December when Trump made the sudden withdrawal announcement, that we have a window of opportunity, I think, now. And that's because now the Islamic State as a caliphate in Syria has been defeated. In March, at the end of March, they announced that the caliphate has been defeated. Not all, there are still sleeper cells, there are still attacks that happen. But, given that the Islamic State in Iraq and Syria once controlled a region the size of Great Britain, I mean, this was a huge amount of territory that was controlled by the Islamic State, that they no longer control this territory. This is obviously a good thing. We have, I believe, in the United States, bipartisan support for the SDF. I attended the hearing where Syria envoy Ambassador James Jeffrey spoke recently at the House Foreign Affairs Committee, and there was the hearing lasted about 2.5 hours. There were many questions from both Republicans and Democrats, a great deal of interest, I think, in the issue and concern about the situation in northeast Syria, because you've sometimes heard, now that we're entering the 9th year, that there is a certain weariness about talking about Syria. But I actually feel now that there is a renewed interest and that there is a genuine concern and willingness to work and make progress in the current moment. And we have a new government also in Iraq and Kurdistan. So all of these things taken together, I think, mean that we have, a window of opportunity to make some progress. So I will just, this timeline shows in 5 different cities of Raqqa Governorate the amount of time that those cities were under control of the Free Syrian Army, the Islamic State, and the Syrian Democratic Forces. So the green is the Free Syrian Army, the black is the Islamic State, and the yellow are the Syrian Democratic Forces. So what you see, for example, in Raqqa is that, the city of Raqqa was under control of the Islamic State from February 2014 till October 2017. So, whereas other cities like Ain Issa, for example, was only, quote unquote, only under the control of the Islamic State for 1 year. So this region, it's approximately 1/3 of Syria now, right? It's a large territory. And the situation on the ground varies considerably, depending in part on how long those cities were under the Islamic State and how long they've had to recover from that or begin the process of rebuilding. So I think that's just something important to keep in mind. So even this 1/3 of northeast Syria, it's, there are some areas that have been rebuilt and other areas that are still largely in ruin and have not been rebuilt at all yet. So the U.S., the decision by the Trump administration to zero out the stabilization funding was a mistake, for both humanitarian reasons and for security reasons. That money has now been released, is my understanding, but the $500 million in stabilization funding for fiscal year 2018 had been put on hold. And if the picture here is from Raqqa, so Raqqa, Deir ez-Zor, Tabqa, Manbij, these are areas that, truly are in a state of ruin and rubble, and they need to be rebuilt. Only approximately 20% of Raqqa has been demined, and it's been 1.5 years, right, since it's been liberated from the Islamic State. So, and only 20% of the city has been demined. If we want, it's given how long Syrians have suffered for how many years through the conflict, doing more to just create, basic level of security is absolutely necessary. If that doesn't happen, we should actually expect that grievances will emerge and that they will find someone to blame. Some other Islamist or extremist groups will come along, maybe not the Islamic State, but Al-Qaeda or some other groups, and exploit the grievances of people that have to live in inhumane conditions. So I think, doing more to not just the United States, but all of there's a Syria small group, including France, Britain, Jordan, the Emirates, that we need to, coordinate our efforts better and focus on providing, doing more to improve the situation on the ground, particularly in Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor especially. On a more positive note, the woman in the picture is Leila Mustafa. She is the co-head of the Raqqa Civil Council. She's a 30-year-old civil engineer. So the cities that are now in this region, they're establishing local governments or local councils, and they have a co-head, so a woman and a man that are, co-governing essentially these cities. And so I think, it's quite remarkable that the city that was once the capital of the Islamic State Caliphate, Raqqa in Syria, is now being co-governed by a woman. I want to focus a little bit on the issue of education. So during the period that the Islamic State ruled over Syria, there was actually an increase in illiteracy, for obvious reasons, because many schools were shut down. And many people simply chose not to go to school, even if there were schools that were still operating, because they simply didn't want to be, they didn't want to go to the schools that were run by the Islamic State. So I interviewed, women, for example, who told me that women in Manbij, for example, who said they basically just, these were Arab women in Sunni Arab Muslim women in Manbij, who basically said they never went outside for almost 3 years. So they essentially became like prisoners inside their own homes to avoid being captured. So, and obviously these have this, not going to school for 4 or 5 years, because also before that there were conflicts and they were in some cases not able to go to school. So this can have a long-term detrimental impact on the people. So it's not just the refugees that are outside of the country where the Syrians are not going to school, or only a small percentage. It's also a problem still inside Syria. Now there are an estimated, this region of northeast Syria, the population, it's hard to know exactly, but it's estimated 5 million people that live in the northeast. About 1 million of them are school age children. The classes, the schools that have restarted now, the student-teacher ratio is approximately 70-1, especially in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor. So it's obviously, the ideal ratio should be closer to 25-1 or 30-1, but not 70-1. And because many of the schools have been destroyed, they also have this double shift, right? So the teachers teach, for example, from 7 a.m. till noon, and then from noon till 4 in the afternoon or something. So they're teaching double shifts in the schools. The schools lack computers, printers. Raqqa alone, there are 43 schools that were destroyed. 36 are still functional. UNICEF has provided curriculum, school books, but my understanding is that some of these cities haven't received those books, so they're still waiting for just the school books to arrive. On a more positive note, this is in the north in Qamishli. This is a school that I visited, the Olaf Tau Association, where they're teaching the Syriac language, or the Syriac Aramaic, the language of the Syriac Christian minority. The man there on the left, his name is Jalinos. He himself is a member of the Syriac Christian minority. And he was the teacher, and it's actually not just the Syriac Christians that are now able to learn and speak their language, but they're also, Esra is a Muslim woman who's learning the Syriac Christian language. I made videos of both of them and posted it on my Twitter. You can listen to them if you like. Jalinos is speaking in English. Actually, Esra explains in Arabic why she wants to learn Syriac. So, under Assad, under the sort of pan-Arabism, Ba'athist rule of the Assad regime, the Kurdish language and the Syriac language were both suppressed. And so I think this is something to be hopeful about, that they're actually embracing the linguistic diversity of the region and teaching Kurdish and Syriac and Arabic in the schools that are functional, especially in the north in Jazeera Canton. Another, I think, misconception sometimes about the Syrian Democratic Forces. As I said, the YPG, when it was first started back in 2015, was primarily a Kurdish force. Now that it's expanded to include a number of other components, the Syrian Democratic Forces is an estimated 60,000 people. The majority of the members are actually Arabs now. It's sometimes referred to as a Kurdish force, but that's not correct. And there are also Syriac Christians who have formed the Syriac Military Council, including both men and women. These are photos and videos that I took near Qamishli and Derek in that region. Now, one concern, I think, is that since December, I believe, the U.S. has been negotiating, Ambassador Jeffrey has been negotiating between Ankara and the SDF about the issue of what Turkey is calling a safe zone, because they claim that this area that's now under the control of the SDF is a security threat to Turkey, and so they've been threatening for months now to stage another intervention east of the Euphrates after the intervention in Afrin, which is to the west of the Euphrates River. And so far, for 6 months now that they've been negotiating this, I believe it's been 6 months, this has not happened. I think this is a good thing. The region that is proposed here in blue, as you can see along the north, it would be, if Turkey were to do this, or if they were to get what they want, they would, the zone could extend as far as 32 kilometers south inside Syria. That would encompass virtually all of the Kurdish and also Christian regions of northern Syria. When I would, in my research over there, I didn't actually go there to do research on this topic. I went there for other reasons, but it was one of the first things that people would speak to me about. Also, Arabs, for example, in Tabqa or Raqqa that are relatively far from the Turkish border, this was one of the first things they would say, is that they're worried about another Turkish intervention. They've seen what happened in Afrin. They don't want that to happen in their region. And so this was something that I found, I think there's a perception here that it's just a conflict between Turkey and the Kurds, but I found that that's actually not the case, that there's wide opposition to this idea of a Turkish safe zone also among the Arab and Christian communities, and also the Turkmen even, who I spoke to, also didn't like this idea. I personally think that Turkey has obviously legitimate security concerns about its border. Those could be addressed, I believe, with unarmed drones, that they could simply use unarmed drones as surveillance. It's easier to monitor a large region with drones anyway than with actual people on the ground. And so this is something that also the UN back in January, when it seemed like this may happen, and some other humanitarian actors, they made estimates as to what might happen if either Turkey or the Syrian regime would try to intervene again or take back parts of northeast Syria if the regime were to do that. Minimal scenario, if there were clashes along the front lines, a displacement of 36,000 people, a limited Turkish incursion along the border, possibly 84,000 people could be displaced, large-scale Turkish intervention, 340,000 people could be displaced. A maximal scenario, if the regime in Damascus were to try to retake all of this region, possibly 450,000 people. I mean, there's no way, obviously, to know for sure. These are estimates that were put out, like what could happen if, these 4 different scenarios. So the U.S. policy is that we want the front lines now, as they are, to be kind of frozen, so that this northeast of Syria can remain, relatively stable and relatively peaceful compared to other parts of Syria. And by maintaining a U.S. presence in northeast Syria, that we continue to deny territory to the regime in Damascus, and that this is also a form of pressure on Assad. So I think the U.S. has now, outlined these 3 objectives in northeast Syria to ensure an enduring defeat of the Islamic State, that we maintain pressure on the regime, work towards a political resolution of the conflict, and that, ideally at some point refugees and IDPs could be able to return home. There have been, when I was in Deir ez-Zor, we were told there were like 450,000 people from Deir ez-Zor, from the regime territory, that had fled to SDF territory. So that adds also a huge burden on the SDF, who are also, for example, responsible now for the ISIS detainees. And there's a discussion about what to do with these detainees. I don't know if that's something we can discuss if people are interested, but I think I'll leave it there for now.
Great, thank you very much, Amy. So I'm going to ask one question to the panel, and then we're going to turn it to the audience for Q&A. Just a couple of points that were mentioned with regards to integrating economic development or development with refugee response from the very beginning. And considering with this particular case that most of the host communities are suffering themselves. So I'm wondering, thinking more long-term, particularly that they have their own economic challenges, as you mentioned, Sahar, they have very high unemployment rates and economic growth is slow. How do you balance basically these two components, and when do you have the conversation? When do you start to have, or when do you start to integrate these programs? Particularly that some of the economic development programs, AID in particular, are focused on workforce development, and some of them integrate refugees in their programming. But where do we start with sort of reframing this conversation? And who needs to take the lead on this in order to shift this approach even further and be ready for to address these challenges on the ground? Richard or
Sure. It's not, I mean, there's not a specific, a single roadmap that applies to all, to every situation. But I think that it's an emphasis, or a new emphasis, I think, that the humanitarian community has adopted, the development community has adopted, that's been articulated in the Comprehensive Refugee Response Framework, some of the work that the World Bank has been doing, that has really started over the last few years, and is, I think, making a significant difference as they deploy their efforts and their resources. So we need to, humanitarian response tends to be focused on the emergency response to deal with, the immediate influx of people, the, life-sustaining support. But as we increasingly have seen these more protracted displacements, it's really critical that we to protect refugees, to enable governments to continue to meet their own commitments to protect refugees. We have to address the needs and the burdens that they face, and that especially includes the needs of host communities. And that's really where development actors come into play. So we work very closely with the USAID, for instance, early on in crises, to look at how we can overlay our humanitarian assistance programming with our development assistance programming to meet both the immediate needs of the displaced populations and the needs of the communities that are hosting them. Because if you bring a lot of people in, like in the case of Lebanon, where a quarter of the population are now refugees, that puts huge burdens on their demand for water, for their electricity, for healthcare, for education. And so humanitarian resources by themselves can't meet all of those needs. It's simply impossible, but we have to recognize that they exist, and we have to address them. And so that's where I think the development actors come in, where the World Bank comes in. And I think we've seen that play out. As I said, there's not a one-size-fits-all approach, but this is increasingly where I think the humanitarian and development communities are linked up in addressing these situations. And we're seeing this in other places like Bangladesh, for instance, as we look at the Rohingya response, and parts of East Africa. And I think that will really be the future of humanitarian and development response.
great.
And I would just say I agree, and I think we've learned that the connection, the synergies between humanitarian and development actors can't start soon enough. The focus used to be on where is that nexus, when do you engage? I mean, nobody wants to take over somebody else's programs. They always want to be involved in the design as early as possible. The fact that refugee situations are going on so long, that most of them are protracted now. We're using the term protracted emergency, which kind of sounds like an oxymoron, but it will continue to be an emergency if it's only the humanitarian actors on the ground. That's why We're working with development actors. They work primarily with governments, and they have development, 5-year, long-year development plans. We're asking them to incorporate refugee populations in those development plans as early as possible. So ideally, immediately when there's a refugee influx, unless you have some reason to believe it's going to last just a few days or a few weeks, which never happens, you should start thinking long-term immediately.
Great. And Sahar, did you want to add?
So I think you also have to separate between, so there's the economic development, the humanitarian aid, but within the humanitarian aid, there's two components that are investing in the long run, but it's not the same as the economic development, meaning healthcare and education. I think that the international community needs to subsidize it, and I don't see a way around it. There might be, you could mitigate the cost by trying to incorporate, again, the refugees who already have the skills, the degrees, the experience to be the teachers, to be the doctors, to work in the hospitals. And I do think that that is a lost opportunity, that is a failure of strategy and a failure of vision to appreciate and recognize that there are people there. I realize that that can create some tensions within the doctors in the home state and the teachers, but there needs to be some form of education to explain to them they're not taking your jobs. The money's coming from abroad through international aid as opposed to coming from your, the pool of domestic resources. So I think that is, to me, non-negotiable, that people deserve basic health care and they deserve education. And just to think about what the repercussions would be of having an entire generation of illiteracy from a country that I think had a pretty high literacy rate within the region. So it's a real travesty. And one can just imagine the parade of horribles of what happens when you have an entire generation that didn't go to school. Now the other part, and I actually think that's an easy solution because it's money. It's political will and money from the international community, from particularly the developed countries. Now, with the other aspect, I think it's much more difficult, which is economic development. How do you trigger, how do you ignite, how do you and develop economies that are struggling, independent of the refugee issue? We deal with it domestically with certain towns and cities in the United States. We have to deal with it in other countries. And so creating jobs, it's easy for us to say, we just need to create jobs. The question for us in the West is what is it that we can do in terms of bringing, our businesses there, employing people, maybe buying some of their goods tariff-free or at a subsidized rate that can we generate the demand and then they produce it there. And that takes some creativity. Now that we have the internet, there might be some online businesses. A lot of these young entrepreneurs have all kinds of really interesting ideas. Many of the women, so something I didn't mention in my initial remarks was part of a derivative effect of the IKEA project and some of the other local small business development projects were that many women who didn't leave their homes primarily because they had childcare responsibilities is they would create home-based businesses, and they had skills such as, some of them would cook things and sell their food to workers. Some of them had skills in embroidery, and as you know, that is a specialty in Syria and also in Palestine and in the Levant in general. So they just needed microloans, or they just needed customers, right? A little bit of money to get the materials, to buy the food, and then people to buy it. It's really not that difficult. At least at the small business level. I think it just takes the willpower. And then finally, as somebody who used to do a lot of research on international foreign aid in Egypt, in particular in the 90s and way before the revolution, is there's a lot of corruption in aid, unfortunately, particularly in the recipient countries, which causes a lot of our taxpayer money to get wasted. And I think our government knows that. A lot of it is just, it's very hard to figure out how to stop the corruption. There's forms of transparency. There's ways that you have conditions to require the target beneficiaries to be part of the execution and implementation process. But a lot of this money ends up either going into the government's pockets through just standard corruption, or the elites end up getting the contracts, and then the wealthy just get wealthier, and the poor stay poor. So we also need to, we all know this, but it comes with international aid. It's the business of international aid, but so we also have to overcome that. So these are difficult challenges, and it's just a matter of us deciding that we're prioritizing them.
Thank you. Amy, did you want to add something, or shall we?
I think
Okay. All right, so let's turn to the audience for questions, and I see the first hand, Ray, in the back, right there. Can you please identify yourself and?
Yes, thank you. My name is Maggie Sullivan, and I have a question for Mr. Albright. So thank you for kind of clarifying U.S. government assistance and talking about how it's very multifaceted in terms of refugee resettlement and also assistance abroad to host countries. So I actually did want to ask some questions about refugee resettlement, since it is still part of the U.S. government's policy. So this year's fiscal year's ceiling for refugee admissions, or presidential determination number, was 30,000. I just looked at the stats from the Refugee Processing Center, and currently, as of the end of May, we've only reached 18,000. So only 347 of those are from Syria. So I was wondering if you could speak to the U.S. government's intention to reach that 30,000 goal in the next 3 months, and then also, if not, what are the barriers to reaching that goal? We all know that refugee resettlement is the answer for all refugees, but it has been determined that we can support 30,000. Thanks.
Sure. With the caveat that my resettlement is not part of my remit, of my direct responsibilities, because I cover our assistance programming. Traditionally, through the resettlement, I mean, we have a 30,000 ceiling. It's not a floor, it's a ceiling. But traditionally, every year, the last quarter of the year is sort of, there's a big surge in arrivals, in refugee arrivals, and that if you look back at the data over many years, you'll see that that's the case. So I think it's very possible that we'll approach the ceiling through the admissions, through the arrivals that occur over the next few months. Yes, it's a lower ceiling than we've had in the past. But it's never been, first of all, in the Syria context, we've admitted 21,000 Syrians. We're continuing to admit Syrians. And I think that's not going to stop. But, ultimately, the resettlement is going to be a solution for the most vulnerable refugees and pretty small numbers of them globally.
Thank you, Richard. We need it for the webcast. Thank you.
Hi, yes. My name is Courtney White, and I'm with Department of Energy. So I just had a quick question, more so about the reintegration of Syrians or even any other group of refugees. It cannot be so easy in terms of the atrocities that they've witnessed. So has there been any sort of resistance, more so speaking to kind of the persona that certain countries give off in terms of the availability and will to help? And then more so, has there been any issues in the reintegration of people if they want to come home? Is it more so a internal issue versus the places that are now stable for them to return to?
Jenna, would you like to tackle this one?
As I mentioned, even though we're not UNHCR advocating for large-scale return or facilitating it, because there very well could come a time and place where we will help arrange the transport and be involved in the mechanics of return. At this point, we're not doing that, but if people choose to voluntarily return, we are present in the departure points in the host countries, like in Lebanon, in Jordan, elsewhere. First of all, to assess the voluntariness of the return, to help counsel them on any documents or things that they may need to access services when they go back, and then finally to provide what information we know about the situation back home. So some refugees are choosing voluntarily, as I said, about 50,000, 56,000 last year, over 1 million internally displaced. When IDPs return to their home communities, that's usually the leading edge of refugee returns. That maybe will follow. So it's not surprising to see much larger IDP returns. We are hearing, though, that we do intention surveys to find out, do you want to go home? If so, when? What conditions? Why not? And what a lot of people are telling us is that the reasons that many don't want to go home yet is, number one, security. There have been concerns, as you know, about forced conscription, and there have been some developments, a window, an amnesty period, but they're still concerned that at some point their young men, boys, will have to serve in the in the Syrian armed forces. There's a lot of concerns about safety and security of the type you alluded to at the community level, community tensions. We've heard anecdotally about stories of people returning and then there's some violence or people are even disappeared. To the extent that that's local conflicts, maybe somebody was squatting in your house and they don't want to give the house back, or is it something more widespread as a policy? We don't yet know. But there's a lot of concern about housing, land, and property. There have been some Syrian laws that have been amended that have to do with a time period where you can reclaim your property. That's still a big concern. And the final issue beyond security and property is just access to services. Is there something to go home to? When refugees do return, we try to get access to those areas of return. We have to apply for permission. It depends on how safe the area is. In some cases, we have good access. In some cases, it's very limited. So at this point, we only have a snapshot of what the conditions are like. We really need full unimpeded access to areas of return and elsewhere before we can make any generalized assessments of whether it's safe and sustainable. At this point, there appears to be a wide divergence. As you said, some areas safer, but maybe the infrastructure isn't there. Some areas maybe not yet safe, but some people may still return thinking they have a window to reclaim property. So it's a big variable situation depending on the location. We're just asking for more access, and we are working with all the partners involved to try to mitigate these issues that are preventing return.
Thank you. Yeah, please.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Sina Mohammed, U.S. representative of Syrian Democratic Council. I would like to ask Ms. Jana about the camps in the northeast Syria, which we have 3 camps there, Roj, Ain Isa, and Al-Hol. I think everybody heard about Al-Hol camp. And even recently, the United Nations, the Human Rights, Commission, they asked about the concern about the humanitarian issue in this camp. Till now, from these 3 camps, from the United Nations, from the International Red Cross, from the coalition, only less than 5% of the need of these camps we got. Less than 5%. Imagine you have 8,000 women, children, 4,000 women, and there is no support for this or any humanitarian support for this camp. This is from the United Nations. I would like to ask this. Another question for the internally displaced people. When we are talking about that, I think it is very important to take into consideration the demography change, which happened in Afrin actually. So these people who are, displaced, now we have the 200,000 in the camp of Al-Shahba, which is the camp of Sardam, of Afrin people who displaced now in this camp. Even there, we didn't get any support for these people. So we would like to know where are these supports from the United Nations going to Syrian people, and these people, they are not very included in this humanitarian support. Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm a little more familiar with Al-Hol than the other camps you mentioned, and I would just say that our key message there is that we agree with you on the humanitarian needs. We've been, we don't control these camps entirely. We have a role there, and we've been sounding the alarm for quite a while, including in discussions with the U.S. government, saying the humanitarian conditions are very, very difficult and unacceptable, both in terms of shelter assistance, non-food items, clearly some of the other assistance that you mentioned. The situation of these camps, because of the security situation, involves a lot of actors. You mentioned ICRC. We have a limited role with certain populations. There are certain populations, as you know, that were more affiliated with ISIS, some of the foreign fighters, as they're known, that we don't have a mandate for under international law. We're calling on governments to accept the return of their own nationals and address them based on whatever the situation was, if they were involved in hostilities, if they were family members, if they were civilians. So we're calling for a holistic approach. We have sort of just a piece of the puzzle, and we're, for anyone who is under our mandate as a foreign national who could be a refugee or, again, still internally displaced who fled the fighting in the areas, we're doing what we can to assist. But we're sounding the alarm. I would agree with you entirely that the conditions are not sustainable and we need to find other solutions. I don't know if Richard wants to address.
Yeah, I mean, I would just commend the SDC and the Syria and the Kurdish authorities for the way that they've dealt with an extraordinarily difficult situation in a very short period of time. And I would commend them for permitting, allowing the access to the international community and the international organizations to operate freely in that space to address the humanitarian needs. I think, it's a very complex situation. Ultimately, the solution for these people in the 73,000 or so that are in El Hol and the other camps, there are about 30,000 Syrian IDPs, there are about 30,000 Iraqis, and another 13,000 foreigners. The solution for these people is repatriation to their home areas or their home countries, and that's something that we've been working with governments on. There continues to be some resistance from some countries, but we think ultimately countries need to take responsibility for their own citizens, and we're continuing to encourage that and working with international organizations on repatriation where that's been possible. There's a discussion with Iraq going on about repatriating the Iraqi population, but it's completely unsustainable to keep that large population in the northeast of Syria, and it's completely unfair to the Kurdish population that lives there to have to sustain this burden and in some ways this threat.
Thank you, Richard. We have time for one quick question. In the back.
Hi, my name is Joette. I'm with Public International Law and Policy Group. I want to thank you all for coming here and speaking about your individual perspectives on the situation. I wanted to ask mainly about the perspective of host communities. If you could share some concrete examples of how host communities have been supported through the CRRF. And relatedly, going back to the first question, how do you square plans for economic development and independence with return and incentives for return? Because I think when people from our region hear about complementary long-term development, they automatically think about integration and naturalization. And I think this has been put forward by Jared Kushner and his Middle East plan, so it's coming into fruition, even though the Arab community governments have rejected it. But still, it's part of the official political discourse. So how do you define complementary long-term development in that regard, which ultimately is not just economic, but political, cultural, and social? Thank you.
Go ahead.
This is more from an anecdotal perspective of our visit. One of the impressions we had by speaking to many Jordanians, some were just average citizens and some were professors and professionals in the civil society sector, is we were very impressed with how welcoming the Jordanians were and how empathetic they were. And it was in light of the challenges that their economy and their society was facing. For example, as a result of the influx of Syrian refugees, particularly in urban areas, 80% of Syrian refugees in Jordan are living in urban areas, and we were in Amman, rents have gone up 300%. Now, granted, most of the Syrian refugees are multi-families in one small apartment because they have vouchers from international aid organizations. But the demand is so high, and landlords were exploiting that. So the rents were going up across the market, and that was imposing a huge burden on host communities, Jordanians. And even though they were upset and they were frustrated, but they were very empathetic. And so I just feel that they do get credit for that. I don't think well, I'm not sure if we would do the same thing in light of what they were dealing with. And water was going up, the cost of water and the cost of electricity was going up, just by sheer higher demand for those services. So I think in that regard, that's just something to note. I will leave it to the experts in terms of the reintegration versus staying versus leaving, but we really got the impression that at least those who were, I don't know about the new generation, that's going to be an interesting question, because now that it's so protracted, so those who left Syria or forced to leave Syria when they were very young or were born outside of Syria, that's an open question. But for those who were adults or young adults when they were forced to flee, they want to go home. They see Syria as home. And then finally, unless the law has changed, you can't naturalize. You can't, even if you're born in many of these countries in the region, they don't have the same legal system in terms of citizenship. So that in itself tends to also be an incentive, if all else, to eventually go home to your home country.
Yeah, I would just say the CRRF approach takes many forms. As I mentioned before, one of the big goals is to get an infusion of cash and investment into governments and local communities. We, to the extent possible, don't want to set up any parallel service delivery systems. Sometimes informal education for kids makes sense, because when kids have been out of school for 5 years, they can't just go right into the local schools and be able to survive, even if they're able. And in Lebanon, you have language challenges. The curriculum is in English, Arabic, and French. Syrian kids are only used to Arabic. So sometimes informal, regulated, but sort of catch-up programs or non-formal education makes sense. But to the extent possible, we want kids in the local school systems. We want people to get their health care from the local community health centers and local hospitals, not from, something that we would do in a camp if that were a different situation. So putting more resources, training, funding into these local government institutions that then is to the benefit of the host community as well as the refugees coming in is what we see as the long-term approach. So education and health centers have been a big part of the CRRF, but even local improvements to water treatment plants, sanitation, again, individual landlords for housing, something that then they have these improvements on their territory so that if and when the refugees go home, they will say, we benefited from this. And yes, the final point on integration, it is accurate. All these kids born, they're registered as Syrian refugees. They're not, at this point, there are no opportunities to become citizens of the host countries. I think the governments, to a greater or lesser extent, know, however, that this population is there for the foreseeable future. The issue is that if we put a focus on education and jobs, this will be to the benefit of these populations wherever they go. If they go home, they've spent this time, instead of wasting their time and their talents, they've got education skills that they can go and use to help rebuild Syria. If they stay in Lebanon or Jordan, they can use that education and skills in Lebanon and Jordan. Hopefully it'll be to the benefit of those communities. And if they're lucky enough to be among the 1% or less, they get resettled in the US and Canada, Australia. We don't resettle refugees for their education and skills, but if they bring that with them, we know that's of benefit to this country. So that's kind of the overall goal.
Thank you.
We're always dealing on the humanitarian side, we're always dealing with the reality that we have. We have a large population that's of refugees that have arrived in these countries, and we need to address their needs, and we need to work with the host governments to do that in a way that is acceptable for everyone. In Jordan and Lebanon, we've had extensive foreign assistance programs for some time, so that has been actually relatively easier than in some other places to integrate the development and the humanitarian programming. There's not, the decision of refugees to return is an individual decision of each and every individual, each and every family, to determine whether the conditions are acceptable for them to go. So it does create a little bit of difficulty in, uncertainty in planning, because we don't exactly know how long people are going to be displaced, except that in the Syria context, we can see that the conditions that led people to leave remain in Syria, and so we don't have any expectation of significant large-scale returns in the near future. But everything that we can do to develop the human capital in terms of health, in terms of education, will help the Syrians. The Syrian refugees will help the host governments and communities, because these people have more chance to be productive members of society, and it will certainly be extremely valuable to Syria in the long run if they come back more educated and healthy to whenever that possibility exists. I mean, the very hopeful scenario is that if we have reform in Syria, if we have a better government, if we have a situation that, economic prosperity, the linkages between Syria and the neighboring countries could be enormously powerful, in terms of economic development. That's a very hopeful scenario, but we try to at least cling to some little bit of hope.
Yeah, absolutely, much needed. Amy, the last word.
No, I just want to emphasize that I agree with what my co-panelists have said about the importance of education. One of the impediments, actually, in addition to the security concerns about returning to Syria, is that in the northeast, the schools there, the degrees are not recognized by the regime in Damascus. So this is obviously also a problem, right? It's like a weapon that Assad is using in addition to the conventional weapons and chemical weapons. Another weapon that he's using is to not recognize the schools or the degrees. So if you're, a 15, 16-year-old person living in northeast Syria, why would you bother going to school if you know your degree will not be recognized by the central government in Damascus? So that's a problem that I think we need to think outside of the box in terms of how can we help get those schools in northeast Syria recognized or accredited, or, if, for example, schools can be rebuilt in places like Raqqa and Deir ez-Zor and people can go back to school. If they graduate with a high school degree that, for example, colleges in the United States or Europe or the neighboring countries might recognize those degrees from those high schools. I mean, for example, we could think of ways that would incentivize high school age and younger students to go to school in northeast Syria. And regarding the issue of universities, again, I mean, we have to think outside of the box, I think, a little bit. If we think about what we did in Germany after World War II, I mean, the creation of the Free University of Berlin, where I did my master's degree, was established in 1948 in West Berlin as an alternative to the university in East Berlin, the Humboldt Universität, right? So it was like the Free University was the idea of promoting a liberal arts education in West Berlin as part of the denazification process after World War II. We established the American University of Iraq, Suleimani, in 2006, after the fall of Saddam Hussein, also part of the de-Baathification, we could think of it that way. I mean, so I think, establishing universities, I mean, in the long term, it would be something to consider establishing a university in the northeast of Syria, which traditionally has been neglected by the regime. And because, frankly, education is desperately needed, both for high school age and at the university level.
Thank you. Absolutely. And then we haven't talked about sort of the role of the private sector and perhaps online education, like more innovative ways, but that's probably a topic for a second panel. But I want to thank you all for participating and sharing your expertise and thoughts and ideas. There's a lot more to process, and I think, as Jenna mentioned, this is a protracted emergency, and I think the key point here is that we want to continue the conversation, particularly around more sustainable long-term solutions in order to give more options to the policy community that is in the thick of it. So thank you all for coming, and we look forward to seeing you in the near future. Thanks. Bye-bye.